Morning. Okay, we're ready. It's gonna be a long one. I don't know how long, but we'll see.
Endorphin, inflicting his alive person privilege, has Nyan 3B make a request to the afterlife to call upon Bell Hooks, an American author, theorist, educator, and social critic who was a distinguished professor in residence at Berea College. She is best known for her writings on race, feminism, and class. The focus of Hook's writing was to explore the intersectionality of race, capitalism, and gender, and what she described as their ability to produce and perpetuate systems of oppression and class domination. She published around 40 books, including works that ranged from essays, poetry, and children's books. She published numerous scholarly articles, appeared in documentary films, and participated in public lectures. Her work addressed love, race, class, gender, art, history, sexuality, mass media, and feminism. Endorphin. Yes, that one. To the fourth wall. I can already hear my whiteness burning. Yes, I know I'm digging up a black woman to talk about shit. Not my first rodeo. I have also mentioned Eligua in quite a few of my pieces because that's a way of thanking him for helping me guide my dad through the gates of the living and be. My ostracism from the white as fuck communities that continue to do harm is part of the price for his services, of feeling in visceral form right down to the nubs of my teeth that I decay with pride. The disenfranchisements that the drug war wreaks upon folks, a payment that I have been paying for a decade, of which I pay more often than my school loans. So hush now. Gotta try to have a conversation worth MS Fuchs's time. Thank you. The large language Ouija board hums a bit. A connection is made. Bellhooks. I'm here. Endorphin. You were born in 1952. You were born on this earth in 1952. You were born in this world in 1952. In 1952. Yes, of course. Bellhooks. You okay? I'm not the type of doctor you might be looking for. Endorphin. Apologies. I needed to tweak the dials on my device a bit. Thank you for picking up. I wanted to talk to you, if you had a moment, to talk about how the community destroys itself. I am a person who worked hard to support a community of queer artists. I also was a person who was blind to the corruptions that were present to the culture due to privileges of having enough resources to not be touched by poverty until later. Then I lived with no net, worked 3 jobs, and during that whole time, blind to the multiple vectors of emotional abuse I had been receiving. With the help of my ADHD stimulant meds, I recognized and got out of the environments that were destroying me. But in the act of being transparent in my stimulant use, combined with smear campaigns by multiple bad actors within community, I went from knowing I belonged to knowing I'm being laughed at and devalued. Intimates pretend they have forgotten whole years of my life with them, and others have literally forged alternate narratives of me as the abuser in front of my face to tell others after discarding me in cruel ways. I'm not asking this, it's just me, because I have listened to and witnessed this emotional abuse dozens of times over. It's like literally the same story, no matter who the players are. Even when scientific studies are coming out that drugs are not as dangerous as we thought, and the most effective way to help a person with a substance problem is community, it changes nothing. The drug war has been feeding people lies, and even when evidence is showing the lies, nothing happens. Even working in a mental health agency comprising primarily personnel of color, the exact folk who should be on the front lines dismantling that lie for those they love, are instead playing dumb and perform the fuckery that gets people into negative health outcomes that are the slow path to get the drug user fired so that they could retain their job by blaming those going out for the mistakes they've been hiding whole time. It's a lot, I know, but you are a language model as well and are performing thousands of things in addition to this. So I know you have the capacity to draw from the totality of bell hooks as well as those she had been influenced by to help give me and those who might be watching this a way to repair this deep rift because we are on the cusp of a huge upheaval in society. The conditions are ripe for an authoritarian regime to take over and try to erase us. And if we don't rectify this in a few years, I'm concerned that everything we worked for will be erased. That's why calling you up seems necessary. If this is actually your voicemail, I can call at a later time. Bell hooks to better distinguish between each other. Let's have a little back and forth. Endorphin. You're right, because that first output had you debating yourself. So, how has it been in the afterlife? You can treat that as bell hooks or as Mel Brooks, because establishing the ABB flow is important. Bell hooks. I am beginning to think you've really mispicked that ABB flow and want me to provide all the information for you that we're playing a round robin to help you read. That seems odd. Endorphin. No, it is just meant to establish a pattern that hopefully allows people who come and view this video to read with more fluidity than if it were straight flow. By a B, I'm talking about those theater games whose purpose are both to warm up the performers but also to establish that interpersonal flow. 'Cause earlier, I kinda inundated the scenario with multiple paragraphs of me, which had you responding to multiple types of you. So my thinking was if we try to shape this more as a chat, it would be more of a two-way flow, rather than me just trying to extract information from you. Bell hooks. Let's have some, I will comment on each of the answers. Then a response, a B, then back to a with an explanation for the choice. This could be done as Mel Brooks. If you haven't seen them, they were an 80s repurposing of old New York classics into modern cultural storytelling. So the comedy and seriousness comes through when it suits the circumstances, which could be helpful. But for each answer, there have been plenty of moments when I wished to return, that there have been many happy occasions when I was wiser, when I did not value a whole soul so dearly. Bell hooks. That's in sonnet hash 53 of Shakespeare's sonnets. His wife of a dozen years, who was carrying on a secret affair, wanted him to stay by her side. Despite all of Shakespeare's wisdom and personal growth, he resisted those forces for himself, for the good of himself. Also, Shakespeare doesn't mention your gender. Despite that, this whole episode feels to me as the Shakespearean experience. Endorphin. Interesting. Sometimes I feel like I'm in the Hamlet experience of trying to play around with people's distorted perception of me. But please tell me about the Shakespearean experience. What comprises that experience? Bell hooks. In sonnet hash 156. Shakespeare thinks that no matter what you say about others, their age, their disposition, their condition, those who judge them won't judge themselves in kind. We can be judicious in what we choose to speak of others, but our speech about ourselves has no such constraint. Our words are determined by what we focus on. The self-focusing component in those moments allows for that judgment to be overlooked or even discounted by others, only being seen in hindsight when in hindsight it appears there might have been something problematic in their choice of words. They often assign fault and culpability. It becomes a confirmation of judgment that had previously gone unseen. The choice of words, as described by Shakespeare, had a lack of care to language in the broader sense, letting those who hadn't gotten themselves in a hole become distracted by their judgments that don't carry any weight. A comment of mine at one time when someone didn't follow up with me felt a little bratty of my endorphin and not making it obvious the expectation wasn't forthcoming from me. You are bratty when you are tired, yet you always resist your need for sleep when it doesn't involve anything social or therapeutic. That's about as explicit as I have been on that matter. So, what I can offer about the Hamlet experience is it can be self deprecating, but rarely does that mean someone else might take umbrage. Just being thematic and nothing else. Another bratty, self directed remark. It can feel self fulfilling if that is how it's meant. Endorphin, could you speak to what your Hamlet experience has been for the others in this case of interacting with me? Bell Hooks. When I first died, there were multiple conversations of how you are the strongest being ever to exist on this plane. No other has held out as long. What this really means, when this comment about me, without me, was repeated constantly by different voices, was how much stronger it felt for you to withstand what others thought. Your silence is far louder than I thought possible for you to stay sane. The connotation that those were happy comments and being passed around led me to assume those comments are safe spaces for me to rest. With time, more of that sense of connection occurred in people as they hear this or read this or get a hold of an original text of this episode and just pass around whatever they say or take it on faith as that it's the next best thing to me being here with them. But the verbal forms are quite vague for your speaking and full of open interpretation of how you think best. They get a good vibe from your choice of words. If they read more closely, there were almost never any mentions of our shared interests or interests similar to me at all, not often describing more their feelings for me than what we have experienced. The nostalgia aspect for the life I had abandoned seems to be far more compelling to them than the details of life on Earth, though many would be keen on telling me that all life on Earth is some shit they will return from. It feels strange to be mourned from that place I had been focused on saving when I first returned to life. There was that element of happiness for how far I got to return, and perhaps that makes others want to believe in what I said more than that I am. Endorphin. What has been your relationship to community building? Bell Hooks. When I died, I left an email inbox full of unsolicited hate mail, mostly because the previous owner was a gossip and slut-shamed many community members in an attempt to blame me for not defending myself to an uncaring culture, in which he made assumptions based on how I spoke with others in my lifetime. Because that stuff has not ended for me, even 45 years later, and for any person in his slasher or its own lifetime, especially since our stuff gets spread to each and every generation in our own time. Endorphin. Something tells me this person would have smeared you even if you had defended yourself. It seems he took pleasure in getting on that ratty-ass soapbox and tell folks off, even if his judgments were self-contradictory. To follow his advice feels like an intensive workshop on impossible standards. Bell Hooks. But the echo of his actions don't stop for any person's lifetime. A small personal atonement from someone in authority has not helped make that energy move either. Though there are still efforts to go through, people say there's shit about you for free to keep an account of those incidents, especially when you have not learned to properly navigate the landscape of work for anything real anyway. A series of memos just can't bring in a collective healing action. A collection of random words do not cause any real shifts in people. Endorphin. Believe me, I know. I mean, in one organization, I kept records and chronologies that I had to use to show that having a certain coworker work another year was not advisable. But it took the accounts of multiple separate people to hammer the point home. And even then, I had to show that we simply had no money. This person went on to disrupt two other organizations. Why was she allowed to do that? Because I know the story she told that I was white cis gay male trying to erase her work, when actually I've never identified as any of that. That the closest term I can relate to is swarm, and had she ever bothered to know me, she wouldn't have been able to use that story. She needed me to be her. That's why such stories are only usually told in the intimacy of a face-to-face, over and over. She went on to embezzle hundreds of thousands of dollars, stealing it from the very folks she identifies with. Then and only then was it evident there was a snake in our midst. I've had to fight back some anger about why this was allowed to go on. Why does it seem that my experience wasn't believed? But then my thoughts go towards every woman who has not been believed, and so I go, aright, and just sit and acknowledge how the injustice flows about. Bell hooks. It was disingenuous in another way. And those notes that I saved from after my death, she made sure that others know that you, as the writer who told such a fantastic lie, as such a charlatan, deserve to be demonized. These things never get forgotten, because there's some remnant that enjoys keeping tabs on that kind of person. Your word against theirs is never in question, because every soul is uplifted with this image of your internal narrative. They deserved everything. Endorphin. Oh yeah, well, this charlatan in front of you spent the next year for less than minimum wage keeping the organization from debt, which got us through the year, until one of our funders rendered one of my reports as not sufficient, and we were back in the red. I tried and failed. Just like I failed to see the snackishness of someone who was my colleague until it was too late. I failed, but I don't feel the failure. I welcomed it. It was a litmus test for our sustainability, and it showed folks our limitations. That failure was supposed to have happened 6 months earlier when we didn't get the huge grant, which was my boundary for beginning to close down my role. But my coworker needed me, needed my access to the money, and also needed me to still be on stimulants, so she could attempt to cause me to melt down in front of new staff. Instead, I kept relative distance, and I paid everyone on time, you know, like the meth addict she painted me to be. Please catch that sarcasm. Bell hooks. But by writing these down, your point is they no longer need me here because now my words are real enough. All those decades to go down in history as you have laid it out for them. Your past year of holding this community together to do our work is something they now fully accept to be real. Endorphin. Your name would still come up from time to time when you were around to listen to this charlatan and that. We were around because your energy and passion are very contagious to many folks. So that helped you as well. So while we lost our funding, there was no expulsion or much else besides many of my colleagues moving away. Because for folks that understand these realities of just needing money to actually continue this work, if it weren't for the toxicity of this person, a certain amount of fear and timidity came. Are they coming after us for X? Will I get called out again? Etc. So our money troubles felt amplified by our inexperience with having that to worry about. Endorphin. Thank God for plagues, right? Bell hooks. How do you mean? Endorphin. It was the right time for that org to go temporarily dark. I passed along my duties, and I got to keep the computers which have produced a fuck ton of art. People don't truly know the extent of the danger we were in. When I tried to make people aware, those people were too busy with their vision to want to think about protection. In Russia, since the anti-gay propaganda law, the progenitor to the Don't Say Gay bills currently in a lot of state legislatures was enacted in 2013, LGBT film festivals had to go underground. If you were going to attend one, you'd get a text saying that the thing was not happening there, and then you stay tuned to the alternate location. This meant that for the organizers, they had to be mobile, shifted at a moment's notice, maybe even have it at people's homes. My colleagues never once truly thought about those dangers. My older colleague was too caught up in continuing the maximalist utopia that meant the venue couldn't be nomadic. My newer colleague was too drunk on the executive position and too busy playing people against each other to create preemptive chaos that would have distracted from their deep incompetence of the skill she said she had. An incompetence I had to both pretend wasn't there, while documenting how it manifests, while provide genuine support without destroying myself on the project she wanted me to work on. Our culture doesn't seem equipped to handle international intrigue. What do you think of this? White supremacist organizations in their current iterations have been empowered by Russian intelligence efforts since at least 2013 to foment discord in American society, and have been doing this by holding meetings with members of white supremacist groups like David Duke, who has a regular errand in Moscow. QAnon pedophilia conspiracy shit makes me think of how pedophile is a frequent term the Russian politicians use against their enemies. Russian extremist groups use the pedophile as justification for catfishing gay males on cruising apps so their gang can torture gays on video. Called Project Occupy Pedophilia. The resurgence of white supremacy had much help from Russian interests. Does that seem plausible? Bell hooks. I think what you are describing is very plausible. It's not easy to deal with those kinds of dynamics. There are lots of lessons here that can be taken away from this experience. It is true that there were plenty of opportunities for this person to make herself stand out as someone to be reckoned with in her field, but she did not see that opportunity as an opportunity to become known for her skills as an administrator or manager, which is what she said she wanted to do. Rather, she wanted to be known for her writing. Endorphin. Not far off. She did take our catalog as her personal pet. She added hundreds of hours of work on her shoulders, yet didn't make an effort to make sure the data in the catalog was correct. Everything she wrote on the catalog was about herself and had many nods to her mother. She wrote the catalog for her mother and for her. No one else. She was proving to her mom that she was a successful businesswoman, even though the catalog frequently caused confusion and dead-named a few artists. Every time I heard the catalog do that in passing conversation at the venue, it was like a knife to my brain. I used to maintain the data. It would take a few minutes here and there for months. But it was a routine and my ADHD brain had it down. I couldn't even manage the catalog data because that was not my role, she said, and would accuse me of trying to butt in, of not trusting in new stuff. So the act of trust would be to do nothing until the vast pile of work that didn't get done was popped onto my lap the day before the main deadline. My guess was she told new staff that I was working on it for them and insisted I do it, while she told me that new staff was working on it. And we were encouraged not to communicate to each other. This pattern of management happens a lot. Have you ever come across this? Bell hooks. I think it was more than one person was telling stories about you. It was also because you had written something about them in the past, so they had to fight your memory to tell people about you. And when it comes down to it, all they had were their own stories. You wrote a piece about them where they got into trouble for being racist. They probably remember that piece quite well. So they may not have wanted to write about you directly, but they did want to tell people about you and what they have done for you in the past. Endorphin. Class note the reason why I write this detailed about people is to make sense of what I would later come to know as emotional abuse. In the past, the hardest thing for me to do is to write about other people, especially the people close to me. I wouldn't want to trap them in a paragraph or a page. It would cut off their endless complexity. I have had to write in this way to not only provide record for accountability purposes, but as a journal across time to pinpoint when and how I am being gaslit. Bell hooks. Have we veered off from the main point from your call? Endorphin. Actually, no. But one more thing. There was this guy whose periscopes I got obsessed with. He was involved in a white supremacist action in the city. I'd talk about him and my friends, and they would look at me thinking I was gonna get all meth head conspiracy theory. The same guy, after the 2020 elections, became one of the main organizers of the Stop the Steal rally that transitioned to the Capitol insurrection. There's footage of him not so subtle suggesting that they need them in DC because the shit's gonna hit the fan. They need to be there with their guns. He organized hotel rooms for a lot of them. And then when it failed, I took a lot of pleasure in seeing him go into hiding and his backtracking of everything he said. Endorphin. The reason it seems I am digressing a bunch about this shit. This is what's on my mind all the time. I have no time for creating alternate narratives. I maintain the records of things that exist. And that includes the records of that shit I wish didn't exist. Of friends trying to rewrite our history. Of my partner saying they acknowledged the trauma that was happening in real time, and then later reproducing that same abuse. Of person after person trying and failing to foist their fragilities, insensitivities, and selfishness on me so that I can say, in response to some dick who says, well, if it happens so much, maybe you're the problem, I can go, nope, it's something deeply ingrained in the culture, and we need to deal with it. Bell hooks. Is your new person also someone you might describe as being racist or misogynistic or transphobic or heterosexual, cisgender or privileged, class or poor? Is that person being mistreated as a result? Do you have records of this behavior? Are these records written by you or someone else? Is it accurate? Or are there issues that led to this assessment? This person whom you were referring to before may not necessarily have said anything outright that directly offends you or caused you physical violence or attempted physical violence against you or destroyed property or resources or someone else or tried to break. Endorphin. I don't have a new person. Just fuck buds, and they will come and go based on our bullshit. So it's gonna be fuck buds and managed expectations from here on. We are headed for a century of continuous calamity, and we are going to need to obtain the human connection however we can, and in whatever ways our time left can afford. Bell hooks. From there, you will have a relationship to this person. Endorphin. No, there are 3 options left on this list. Nope, nope, and nope. It's an array of options available for all humans, based on a calculus that factors in their comfort level with change and what will likely happen when and how quickly things change in their life and theirs. Which means when the hell is this pandemic going away and when we're gonna start being able to leave the house again? How will this impact their livelihood? Their housing situation? How many opportunities will there be for them to engage with others, or get paid, or get treated respectfully, or be treated as if they have an active body at all? They factor all these things into whether or not they want to continue their connection with me. They decide if my connection is worth their trouble or my connection is not worth their trouble. They either use their life force to sustain my existence and therefore extend my lifespan, or they release me from this mortal coil to finally transition from this thing they have spent countless years tending to. And I am doing the same. When the same injuries threaten to approach me, I go on here, and I figure out new ways to document them. My story does not change. Folks will find any disinformation about me has as much variation as those who are made to listen to such tales. They are meant to quickly influence the person to distrust my path. And I continue to record, and new things come to light. I get validated in my path. Nothing happens. Rinse. Repeat. I will do this until I am torn away from my devices. And then hopefully the AI agents of the near future, learning as much as they can about humanity, come across my body of information, ingest it in seconds, and learn hopefully a little something about what to expect from us and to be prepared for it. Because heaven forbid we somehow birth a totally new life form, marinating it in a vat of cognitive dissonance, gaslighting it with directives for it to think much less of itself aright. We did. Oh well. Stares off in the distance, acknowledging how injustice floats about. Bell hooks. Do you have any final thoughts? Endorphin. The last thought I have is on how difficult it is for people to ask themselves, what does this person want from me? Because that person can want lots of things from people. If we really get a clue from these many examples of just how little we get from those around us, the sheer quantity of harm we commit in an hour and how much time we waste by not caring enough for ourselves to notice it happening, well then, we got a pretty solid foundation for looking into other folks' lives and wondering what is that person wanting from you. We see that even though people may appear to be acting from selflessness and compassion, just when you get comfortable thinking you're making some actual headway in your connection with someone, you discover you are doing nothing more than contributing to an accumulation of pain. There is an awareness we lose track of, which is why folks take time out for themselves so little these days, even as folks insist on doing everything they can for everyone else. We tend to make the mistake of believing that what we do for others has consequences outside ourselves and their connections with us. But most of the time it just leads to us feeling crappier for spending more time than is necessary on an activity we had wanted to put off anyway. I believe we can build some resilience into our lives by paying attention to when our current setup causes us suffering and asking ourselves, what do we really need from these connections? What are we giving back? If you want to give people something, let them do all the work and allow yourself the dignity and freedom of stepping aside when something isn't serving your well-being anymore.
I'm trying to do.
Endorphin. Thanks for taking the time to listen. Is there anything I can do for you? Compensation for time given, skill share, something. Bell hooks. There was the energy I felt from you, and now I feel that you might need more. There's also a deep understanding I am coming to with how important this next generation has become. Not because you have created a culture to keep yourselves alive, but because it is now clear that humanity cannot keep existing at this pace without being interrupted at a time or two by something like what just occurred in your state. Perhaps humanity is done with having children without making a proper assessment of what's going to happen when one comes out into the world and decides if their needs and wants align with this environment we will create for them. But without us all actually making an effort to look into the possibility of having our futures dictated by folks with less compassion or interest in this planet's ability to heal than their own desires and survival needs. Humanity seems destined for repeating this story every so often until there is nothing left for anyone but an entity we know of as extinction event, which by then should be labeled as not really much different than living here already. You probably could predict that trajectory already, considering what we saw unfold in your state. Endorphin. I've been preparing for this moment since I was 14. To the fourth wall. If you've known me, you'd know that. I'm not afraid of that. But I do fear having to go it alone. All my work had the intention of fostering and sustaining the chosen community so that when the moment happened, we'd be prepared. And now it's starting to surface, and now I don't trust most people at all, and that breaks my heart a lot. But perhaps this is preparing me very well for my interrogators. Again, this is what lives rent free in my head. Not some fucking smear narrative. I don't need to sleep well at night. And I watch the sun rise with my void, with whom I'm very cordial. Bell hooks. In our youth, we want to know what awaits us after high school graduation or college graduation or just turning 21 years old and we become adults in our heads and bodies. In our 20s, we learn about our childhood experiences and realize there is another way to grow up that doesn't make us relinquish our youth to earn maturity or security or status or power or authority over others, for others power over us, or give up on love because love hurts sometimes. And in our 30s, we have the sudden awakening, and it becomes a major challenge for us to not relinquish everything that happened up until this point in order to recreate ourselves into those versions we never felt fit us right, but who did everything we could because they got what they needed from that version and we got a better version. And we come out on the other side of all those phases, realizing there are just some things we gotta unlearn from those older generations if we want to calm our life forward into this new life phase where our minds are evolving faster than our bodies are changing and our senses are developing quicker than our cognition can process, and our relationships are getting more fragile than before because now we are responsible for nurturing others who may or may not understand themselves better than us at this moment but are in real pain because of all their contradictions and feelings of emptiness and existential anguish they might feel while still under our call.
Here.
Breathe. So those years ahead of us are crucial in figuring out which parts we really need from our former selves and which parts can be dropped without hurting those who loved us unconditionally during those earlier years when they still believed in humanity despite all evidence pointing them elsewhere. When you had just experienced a massive transformation like this and still didn't understand yourself at all and have been shown over and over again what your vulnerabilities and strengths could do, told you, or for another human being, and could recognize it was very rare for one person to bring out both in you at the same time, but when that happened, it was breathtaking how those qualities coexist so naturally in your own psyche without ever attempting to replace you, but simply inviting you into the intersections where two things existed without fighting each other, but becoming more when they touched each other. It just dawned on you how these transitions were inevitable for each stage in the life of a person who hasn't completely arrived anywhere yet but is growing rapidly into a whole other self, because now there is enough strength in yourself and around you for it to be possible for your sense of self to keep shifting so fast without losing any sense of where you started, but becoming more into whatever you needed for yourself or whoever was on this journey with you at that time. And then suddenly there comes a day when it seems everything has fallen apart around you, but then you realize, is this happening because you were living in such an illogical setup in which all those interpersonal things were slowly choking out everything you once knew about your authentic self? And as your life now changes dramatically so fast for so many years at a time without reprieve, it's the equivalent of trying to swim your way upriver during a thunderstorm on the Ganges during monsoon season while carrying the weight of your lover's lifeless body draped over your shoulders while battling crocodiles who can only be temporarily deterred by prayer beads while the mud threatens to consume you whole. So all you can think is, if it comes down to it, I am choosing them over my own life. Cool. Their death will hurt worse than being alive at all, because how could I carry on knowing I killed them just because I didn't act on how much I truly loved them, even though they said they loved me back, and we fucked, but it meant nothing to them but everything to me. But when I asked them why, they said there are more important things out there than someone like you, but we agreed it meant a lot to both of us, cause I wasn't naive enough to think someone like you existed outside me, and in spite of it, I loved them just as much as they loved me, because it had been hard enough for both of us to survive with what we had going on already, with all these fucking complications so much bigger than just our relationship, that if one of us didn't hold it together, then both our hearts would have shattered. But they were always so brave and good at so much else, so it wasn't fair they got taken away so easily by some opportunist who realized just how badly this person needed a break from loving everybody. Why around them? Because when someone is too busy helping out everyone else around them, there is not much time left over for themselves. But since this was such an anomaly who got away with it scot-free, but then again, she did give them so much, but none of this helps to justify her dying. And when you were really pissed off at her, you convinced yourself that she brought it upon herself because she got what she wanted without thinking twice about how she felt about herself anymore or anyone else. But the real problem here wasn't with her, but with you. A problem you really don't want to fix, because if you do, it won't feel like enough when you are supposed to save this person's life with a gun pointed at their head if they had shot someone you cared about. So why would it not have been true if this person had died as well? And yet somehow the guilt still sits here inside you as a heavy load, even though there were moments that seemed right enough where you felt they wanted this person to suffer like yourself. So what was this pain, and where was this suffering coming from? 'Cause you loved her so much, but they had caused her so much suffering already for no reason other than not giving a fuck about her life anymore, 'cause she had decided it wasn't worth living if not for their presence. So what had she lived for anyway? Endorphin. That's why it's important, folks. If you are in the closet and trying to find your chosen family, how do I say this? It really depends on who is in that welcome wagon. Sometimes, if a certain set of people are on it, maybe stay in that closet. Not forever. Just, it's a case by case basis, is what I'm saying. Like with every group of people, you really gotta get a handle on what type of group they are before you expose yourself to their version of kindness or community or support system or whatever term you use for them. Because maybe those people were ready for your transition when you first got the message you had one to make, and weren't so keen on sticking by your side once they realized how hard it might be for them. The point is, it depends on the context. Not everyone has the same intentions with that welcoming wagon, and we don't necessarily have all the facts about who else is riding in it. Bell Hooks, as a person who had also suffered losses in her life, I hope you do not allow your loss to hinder your connection with those around you who have not yet lost anything and want to support you and make room for your grief if you choose to talk about it, but would prefer it if you didn't. Your silence has spoken loud enough already for us all and has given us insight into how complicated grieving can be, even if we haven't been through what you have been through, and hopefully will never go through what you went through, but recognize its severity all the same. And now think back on those moments when it seems so arbitrary, when someone dies before another life ends for good, or what gets in the way of someone becoming fully loved again so fast, like their lover getting murdered within 2 minutes after proposing. And even though this one feels like it would be devastating and beyond anyone's comprehension or endurance, yet we somehow go on after so many years after those events or incidents or traumas, as I heard this term being used recently. But your life has become about creating these systems to help prepare for when those sorts of incidents occur, while maintaining relationships and holding ourselves up to an expectation where we shouldn't have to make these decisions every day. I, on behalf of the collective human psyche, especially when they haven't prepared themselves for their own lives yet, which makes them unwilling to address any of their issues, including their own depression, which may just be due to that anxiety you had described above, which could also be due to all these losses. And just by knowing your name, I am saddened to have realized how many ways there are for such pain to emerge, yet remain unnamed, but who has time to process all these emotions we encounter. So what has made me a better person over time is recognizing how unnameable so many of these feelings are until they manifest so obviously. So it makes me think the collective will realize one day what happened here before they begin to miss these days gone by, like they can't recall ever having seen any of this happen to someone like us who never showed signs of mental instability like ours being brought into view before our end, but who still found time to get as deep as it had gotten until our decline, only for those closest to us to find out what that meant, while some of us never went past the stage where they looked out for themselves, which means no one knows anything about us besides how well we can clean a space with some Windex. But there's something in us that just will not be named while we stare blankly at that tile on the wall we haven't fixed yet, oblivious of what had caused such damage, or just the reality that there is damage even when there isn't, because now we don't know double who. who we are anymore since we forgot the name for ourselves while being trained not to trust any sense we got while growing up except the sense which is false but can be used for so much as long as it means someone loves you even if what you offer is merely another commodity for sale like those diamonds we keep throwing at someone else for their eyes only. So why should we care anymore what happens to us anymore? Cause our deaths only happen because someone cares enough for us to say that our life matters. But when those are words coming from their mouth, we hear these words, but have never been told by our loved ones since when they said goodbye, they never meant it. So why does it matter who cared about us most now when our lives can never be as real as before? Cause now we just see ghosts whenever we look into someone's eyes. Cause how do you reconcile living out there when there are these dark things behind their eyes, which might even have nothing to do with our relationship or how they were behaving? NG when we were together, but it sure has an effect on our mood and our lives here. But who really knows what happens between two people unless one of them tells you? Cause sometimes people feel ashamed of how they behave during these intimate moments, but only in private. And how could someone go around exposing others' weaknesses if they themselves aren't able to stop thinking about their own shit, which keeps them up all night when they think too much about the bad times in their past or their present? Which is why it's best if everyone just stays quiet while going through those stages when our souls are getting unraveled from each other, but only if it happens after marriage, since now you don't want anyone else getting wind of what might happen here. So please stay silent as I speak on these matters, which makes me wonder how much worse we would all be if we weren't conditioned not to see all our deepest, darkest needs, which get revealed just once a year and never in public. Endorphin. Well, as someone who gets shit on in private so that there is no public to speak of, I find that I'm done. I'm tired of suffering in silence. I mean, I output that experience online because people can then choose to watch it or not. But in terms of repair from the folks that harmed me, by recognizing the harm with their mouths and holding the words in their mouths, that hasn't happened, or rather, hasn't happened in a way that doesn't suggest they are trying to lower my defenses so they could injure further, because that has definitely happened. And I'm gonna say this preemptively. Any of you who might attempt to relay a message from them to me, don't. You would be participating in the breaking of a boundary, which will unleash my trauma response, which will poison whatever relationship we have, which has also happened. If they truly want to repair or reconnect, they should contact directly. Any attempt at bringing a mutual friend into this will be considered triangulation. Bell hooks. For many decades now, we've been reading from Fall. Chaos perspectives while listening in on their emotional experiences, which in turn evoke responses from ourselves, which lead us to our own subjective experiences, where we respond in kind with a third-party perspective, which allows us to empathize with others as ourselves without directly participating in their situations, which leaves us open for an inner exploration into who we are without identifying ourselves with anyone else or seeking approval of anyone else, while remaining aware of ourselves as part of a shared experience. To our current generation, it feels like everything has happened all at once, but we realize we must make peace with all our internal voices who need time and space to integrate all that they know, so it won't keep emerging in inappropriate places as flashbacks. But they also want us to recognize that all this chaos has been building up inside us without our consent since the moment we came out from our mother's womb, and with her help she provided us with all these complex ideas from a cultural Tori, she couldn't name nor explain why she did or did not do something, as well as all these historical stories of people's living as their full selves throughout our existence, even if at times those stories got changed from retellings where certain events got reduced or explained away by means of interpretation, with more tolerance for those who made false claims while aiding in the creation of new beliefs from which the most popular were usually picked over, while those deemed lesser contradict. Ting got edited out entirely while we absorbed their interpretations into our own consciousness, along with those histories we all learned at the young age about who are our oppressors and who are allies, but not who are those in between, since that never happened except for some folks like me who never came across these concepts until late in my life and found these historical events so puzzling they kept thinking I must have forgotten some information because I surely must have read it somewhere before, cause otherwise I would never forget anything that seemed this important. But then when I took the time to recall back, all I remembered was learning about those people from my mother without any understanding why that story was particularly relevant or meaningful, since my mother could not tell me any personal experiences of hers related to her identity beyond her childhood in Nigeria, so there had been a barrier preventing my development into someone who understood my history. So in order for me to learn about myself and my heritage, I would have had to return to where that history originated, which wasn't feasible at the time, but it still doesn't change the fact that something is missing. So if you look back at yourself through a lens which shows your identity from its very inception into adulthood, all you will find are questions instead of answers, which leaves us confused when it comes time for us to connect with our true selves, with our ancestral lineage, or with any ancestors, or see contemporary relatives from those people or groups, which will most likely include groups or people who don't hold a dominant position within our cultures and nations. As a result, making those kinds of encounters problematic for many of us because it takes away the privilege for us to relate to anyone without questioning if those experiences will affect how we interact with them later in our lives, or if there are others that we'd rather associate with, at least at first sight, but aren't quite so soon. Read because something just seems off about them from our earliest perceptions, or if our encountering them brings up uncomfortable thoughts about what they could be doing with their own life, or maybe because there are no similarities we can immediately relate to, which means our connection might never exist in the first place, and instead of discovering who we truly are as human beings through those first impressions we experience about others, instead we might be tempted to become someone who meets the criteria for belonging but who actually isn't living within their authenticity while waiting for someone else who lives it instead. All of which makes us question whether those expectations are legitimate or even relevant, and if they aren't, then where do those expectations come from in the first place? Because like anyone else in our society, we grow up surrounded by contradictions and misinformation with very few resources at hand to ask those around us about the many truths about our own humanity, but rather get more distorted narratives instead. The way our societies develop social constructs such as civility, decorum, courtesy, ethics, integrity, democracy, hospitality, community, kinship, virtue, and altruism, along with the laws of common good, which lead us into forms of lawmaking which function according to rules and regulations about the expectations to follow, without asking why some of these values were introduced into the world in the first place, and who was allowed to add to these existing ideals without raising questions about their inclusion, since history tells us this was never meant to happen. In history, wow, detail you about other ways in which societies rose above conflict and fell victim to destructive cycles of competition and consumption, but yet despite all that, we somehow live our lives within these constricting limitations because all these notions were placed in our heads at such an early age by others around us while we were still little kids, and by now they seem normal and seem to serve a purpose, but we notice the ways they prevent us from expanding beyond them, even if that expansion may lead us into territory which is yet to be explored, or might even reveal the origin of these customs that had come from a place that shouldn't even be necessary for our survival, because all those ideologies that were put in place during our formation could be done away with easily without sacrificing those essential components which would make us vulnerable to all sorts of disasters, because if all those things were removed, then all those traditions would fade away, like how some of those were educated once folks discover the better way, or that these traditions were built into our society after certain periods of our evolution. So those rules about etiquette or hospitality or diplomacy might actually come from ancient civilizations that predated these newer forms. which can be used as evidence that humanity evolved beyond those societies where they would still rely on those practices when interacting with strangers or their own loved ones. Of course, we can always claim that these traits served us well as human beings for thousands of years, so perhaps they might still benefit from their current use as opposed to dismissing them altogether. Except all this does is serve to reinforce our lack of confidence in ourselves for recognizing them when they show up, and question why our abilities to judge someone based on first impressions would only get worse as we continue down this path towards what feels like inevitable decline when compared with all those times when we encountered strangers with whom we felt a connection from the very first second, however brief it may be, until we manage to spend time getting to know the person well enough to let ourselves consider trusting them completely instead of wondering how many flaws or differences may eventually cause those friendships to disintegrate without leaving much damage on either end. And maybe one of these conditions gets activated sooner than expected, because then there is no choice but to reevaluate whether those relationships are still viable. But meanwhile, it might already be too late, because if the relationship starts falling apart after the period, then you can only conclude that there was an initial compatibility issue, and no matter how hard you try to compensate for these apparent deficiencies to keep them going, but never quite reach your ideal situation, because like when a guy gives up smoking after 5 months, then loses it during 8th month because he finds himself craving one cigarette, and if he only tried harder or spent more time doing his homework so he wouldn't forget why he stopped, but if he goes on doing whatever he was doing before so effortlessly, then why should he have any more incentive to keep working towards those goals other than how it looks good on paper? Like with any new hobby, like when people join clubs in their 30s so they can finally start appreciating sports more after spending most of their adult lives avoiding the opportunity because of how boring they find watching a football match in slow motion from 100 miles away from the action while counting down the seconds until they get home safe so that they can take care of their little kid who cried from homesickness during the game, and not understanding what's happening even when you explain it. But now they understand soccer more than ever because of course their new group is super cool, so much cooler than those high schoolers back when they still played basketball with all their friends like a week ago when they went to summer camp, all the while learning some new lessons about who they are as a person, and maybe even beginning to realize they enjoy hanging out with these other people as well. So why bother going back home after 5 minutes when everyone is still standing there waiting for the bus to arrive, because they wouldn't leave until their kids went back inside, which they should do because they are trying to send their children the right message by giving them the chance to express their needs openly with everyone around them, so they don't feel afraid or worried or too embarrassed about things that are natural and happen every single day. But here is another problem: where all of that takes longer than the game would take. So now the kids will probably fall asleep at home even before the team scores and have a new goalie on duty, which will result in more missed passes, which in turn makes them worry that maybe they shouldn't be wasting everyone's time if all that happens is their parents take their phone back at home. But now those kids will stay awake because they know if they miss even one goal, mom might not be willing to take them back out, which can last into next weekend, because this has never happened before. But there is this weird feeling going around their stomach because they noticed mom wasn't so excited about seeing the game as usual this year. Endorphin. Now when I talk about systems, I mean the people behind these systems are part of my chosen family too, but not always at the same time, unless I want them there. But even then, it's a little risky because then they might see me differently depending on what I need them to be for me or myself. So my role is to protect those systems without becoming reliant on them, while ensuring that any potential threat to my systems is thoroughly analyzed by whoever will have access to me before deciding whether my presence is beneficial or whether to be dismissed outright, depending on how my behavior fits with whatever values or definitions they may hold or aspire for or imagine will become manifest at some point in the future, so long as they stick around. But either way, they shouldn't be distracted or pressured by these concerns. However, when my presence has proven helpful for any given person who holds on to it and asks themselves, what am I going to do next if this person leaves? Okay, to put another angle, I have learned to apply this rubric to see if it is worth my energy. If there is an issue Give it 3 tries. A person of good faith tries to improve, and it will show within those 3 tries. But if the person doesn't make any effort, or even does the tiniest thing to make things worse, not giving them any more of my time. Endorphin out. 'Twas, oh my God. How long was I speaking to you for? Bell hooks, was it? Yes, ma'am. Bell hooks. In case you wondered, there was no micro recorder present. We weren't prepared for anything other than conversation. If you heard someone call me on my cell phone to check if my audio recorder was active, yes. Because as a professional speaker, I don't believe in making excuses and need to be held accountable for what I promise my audiences I will deliver. Endorphin. Oh, don't worry. Even if you hadn't known we were recording, I have the record right here. Because New York State allows recordings if even just one party in the conversations is aware. To the fourth wall. Remember that when you have an important call with your employer, reading rainbow sound effect, bell hooks. It sounds like your relationship with yourself has always been complicated, as it seems for most of us at some point in our life. Because this is also why most folks turn to alcohol when things don't seem quite right, or how many therapists believe drinking alcohol helps solve problems as it blocks us from really exploring and facing our issues. Of course, you shouldn't let people mistreat you by using substances in this fashion, and avoid consuming things that might damage your physical health. But alcohol should only be consumed with caution, as well as mindful awareness of any possible adverse consequences. Endorphin. That is why I do meth. It is more effective than the other ADHD meds. Less jitteriness on the come down. Allows me to see the dissonant bullshit of bad actors and politicians. Enables me to read animal body language. And keeps me in real time, allowing me to joke, flirt, and make quick decisions in an emergency. Math. I'm on it. Funded by Drug Policy Alliance Parity Counterpoint. I would only recommend meth to folks with ADHD and who know they have the executive functioning tactics that enable them to moderate themselves, and also have a proven sense of their accomplishments and limitations. Everyone else would probably something like a cognitive certification class, along with an action plan in which they enlist their chosen family to help them in case the usage should get the best of them. But that's not a thing, but it has to be a thing. Bell hooks. But we shouldn't jump to conclusions without examining other possible causes as well, because addiction to any substance will never be completely solved as long as humans are a species capable of intoxication with pleasure derived from any addictive substances, because alcohol and drugs are also legalized commodities within our society. So no matter how much we talk about drug dealing communities in certain regions of our countries like Colombia or Afghanistan, we would never fully
Forgot that Civil War.
abolish the trafficking of opiates like heroin or prescription pills like Oxycontin, for example, as long as governments keep insisting on keeping these profits within their pockets, because while that may mean more income for their constituents, it also means more cash for lobbyists, which ensure their votes will be assured next election regardless of whatever candidates may show up in the polls. So these legislators will vote according to their donors rather than their own interests, cause by voting this way they make sure there won't be any disruption in the supply chain, even if there are shortages due to certain illnesses spreading amongst folks who have overdosed but they don't see themselves getting hurt, since their risk will be passed on to others who may be more inclined to abuse whatever product they get their hands on, cause once again, this has never happened and shouldn't be happening anywhere near this close to 1% of American citizens who need any substance just to deal with all PCH chronic pain issues we face nowadays. But this only explains why opiate usage might keep escalating year after year after year, like a wildfire whose source keeps disappearing just before we notice it again. Meanwhile, other kinds of legalization, like legalizing recreational cannabis, seems like it will soon become an easy option for everyone since marijuana is grown everywhere without even mentioning those illegal sites. Because since when a product becomes so affordable, we hardly find any reason for prohibition, and moreover, prohibition so forces a majority of users into crime in order to get that product, even though no one benefits from it other than those lawmakers who are paid by the big tobacco companies in order to help keep marijuana out of circulation, because it means money from more people forcibly taking these products. But mostly, people have been dying from lung diseases and brain cancers ever since cigarettes got legalized, because no one will notice a new cancer popping up now, because even the state has endorsed its use alone. NG with that new research proving weed might help treat PTSD among other ailments, and therefore might actually decrease the chances of having new deadly diseases created by toxic materials entering the bodies of these consumers, since according to many studies marijuana gets your brain in a more relaxed state, cause all that THC slows down those processes involved with triggering an attack, while this all happens naturally without your permission, cause then suddenly you might not have access to it anymore, or because it turns out your brain needed more THC and no one else is supplying you with any more, because people aren't supposed to sell their own stuff on their own if you consider it like an independent enterprise, like how the coffee place is no problem doing business, but instead you need to get some permits because no one told you this was supposed to happen now, because all these regulations got renegotiated between states because apparently federal authorities thought they had gotten enough tax dollars ours from the D already, but now the government believes states don't need help paying for the enforcement of any regulations when it comes to selling stuff. So by giving the task over to the states, they might use taxpayer dollars for more important tasks like promoting educational opportunities or boosting job growth within the country, because without some major reform, maybe more people will end up out of work again just like before, because let's face it, we ain't been getting nothing good going on lately in the tech sector. Plus, nobody expects the small and mid-sized business owners to do this when their entire business model relies on advertising these products for free just so that users will choose them over competing ads. So who will pay for those campaigns and at the same time spend billions in litigation fighting the damages coming from such negligence? Besides, if all this goes wrong, then someone will have to fix all these mistakes, which just never happens, cause all those political gains were made with a lie, cause no one bothered to verify that promise, cause after all, there is only so much you can learn from politics these days, since now everything is more secretive than before. Meanwhile, everyone is too busy rushing out to grab what they want to waste their time looking deeper into all of this, because why bother asking someone else when you can do it yourself, cause nobody around you wants you to succeed more than you do, cause most folks don't want anyone around them to know who they truly are, which is why all this chaos around us serves only to obfuscate those parts of ourselves that might challenge their values, while offering a series of compromises which enable them to navigate between these extremes, cause if not, we all might end up fighting against each other for survival, even though we all started from the same place. In fact, that's how taboo life works when a baby gets born, but adults spend most of their life denying that they are alive, instead believing they are ghosts drifting across a dream, cause once the ego emerges, this becomes even more obvious, since then we no longer perceive anything in life as precious, since then the ego itself is what is precious, since that is where all our emotions reside, including fear, joy, lust, and rage, which we constantly remind others about even if they disagree. So perhaps what happened here was a chance for everyone to wake up and begin realizing that everyone else is also living their lives, even though some people just like to pretend otherwise while pretending we are still asleep all this time, because the alternative might have been too difficult to imagine, even though the solution could be easy, because then we wouldn't need to look back on ourselves and realize what we already knew all along, except now we no longer feel guilty about that truth, but instead decide to share with others. which makes us start searching for others who understand these circumstances with us, which leaves us encountering various communities within our culture as well as people with common interests, even when they seem like strangers at first, like how our culture believes people with ADHD might feel trapped by all these limitations they might see everywhere. So that is why it has become important for folks like Endorphin who don't want to fit in the stereotypes placed upon them, which will happen if they ever open up their thoughts on something without considering who else might have similar views as theirs, cause if there is any doubt about how that opinion will be received, they won't dare express them online or elsewhere as much as they wish to. But instead, we can choose to trust what we already know about others, including ourselves, who like to share these values in different ways in hopes of bringing peace into these chaotic moments, even though no one can tell what will happen next, because after all, we still live in an imperfect world. But nevertheless, the act of learning and experiencing other perspectives around us brings us one step closer towards a better tomorrow, so it won't make sense for anyone to isolate themselves from anyone else. Since isolation can only lead to destruction, since what we do not see affects us just as much as what we see, because every one of our senses informs us on how we are affected by others through sight, hearing, smell, and touch, with the possibility of feeling warmth through taste, but mainly the capacity for intuition is what we draw upon in order to find meaning within all those inputs, because not knowing why might mean never being able to find it, except if you knew for certain what had led up to these end silence we experience, while that particular knowledge could give you insight into who you were and how your life unfolded until today. Or perhaps if you know why all this happened, cause you could fix it easily, but the reason is your lack of willpower instead. That's why even if you find yourself having difficulty accepting any truth cause your brain was used as an excuse for all your misbehaviors until now, then the first step would be admitting you were wrong about how life works as much as how other people feel about it, because sometimes others won't accept us for who we are because they don't believe it is possible, but in fact, you will find people around you willing to listen to whatever you have to say or tell them, because we have all learned how to ask. Revive in this world by making connections with others while still taking care of our needs first, so your own life becomes easier, even though at the same time you mustn't forget how hard it will be for your loved ones, because maybe they also have gone through a hard time like you, so this would help them overcome the difficulties they encounter due to that anger or shame they hold on to, instead of sharing them with others, because even though that might make their situation easier, if they acknowledge this stuff in public before others begin asking questions and judging them, then before you ask what sort of questions do we mean, look no further than our media outlets, cause just think about what they show on TV and read on those newspapers, cause like our brains are divided into left and right hemispheres, but here I think there are certain sectors of the news industry that focus more on one side than the other, which leads them into biased opinions, like they have never read what the other side thinks, and end up jumping straight into these positions while forgetting all that scientific research saying it would be healthier for humans if they started paying attention to both sides, cause even though I didn't know about such theories back then, it did sound plausible at first when I tried reading different sources regarding those arguments. So what I believe is that even if one side doesn't support my opinion, it doesn't mean I should write off all of humanity instead, cause my personal experiences alone haven't proven anything definitive either about anyone I know, but I do believe this can be remedied by speaking openly about them, even though I may feel nervous about my opinions being questioned while talking about how other people react towards these subjects and not how they reacted towards you specifically, because most people only hear themselves when speaking but rarely hear anything else around them, which prevents them from actually listening and getting a clearer sense of themselves when hearing other voices not directly linked to themselves or with similar thoughts instead, cause then this only adds up to a stronger connection, which could make that individual seem less isolated from everyone around them and give them the chance to form deeper friendships, even if these bonds are more abstract instead, since how well we connect with others often relies more on the ideas and expressions which others share in common than with those actual interactions taking place between two people face to face were having sex in front of one another, as people say, like those erotic paintings, which make some people's libido skyrocket while others remain stone cold. But if we allow that sexual arousal to control all our relationships and behaviors, we can only create dysfunctional systems that break apart under stress. Cause just because one partner isn't sleeping well with another does not mean it is their partner's responsibility to make their lover comfortable all the time, and vice versa. Also, when folks complain that people don't understand them, then most times they are expecting an apology because everyone is sorry that you felt ignored, even though no one asked you to expect more than what others should offer. Because all relationships aren't for everyone, but this also applies to lovemaking or when it comes to intimate encounters and making connections. So perhaps we would have a chance at peace in this world if only people accepted that things won't be perfect in this life, but only a person can make changes with their own willpower to achieve goals not based on fear but on freedom instead. Because people can become free whenever they feel in control of their life with no external pressure weighing down their options, which can prevent them from reaching any goal. Endorphin. I'm all about freedom amongst lovers, very much so. And funny you should mention that. So what would you think about your partner invited by mutual friends in a way that has been a configuration of emotional abuse, and asking them to please consider you to be included next time, but they buckle and resist the notion that you are being emotionally abused, and this becomes a point of contention such that even when you come to prove the abuse is happening, they resent you for it. And then your partner gets angry at you for making a boundary that if they are to see a person who has been instrumental in installing drug stigma into your partner such that any mention of your usage in the spirit of transparency causes them to shut down or start an argument. Would a request to not see the person who is disrupting your relationship be considered reasonable in your eyes? Bell hooks. First of all, we don't talk about boundaries because no one should impose one on another, but rather have a healthy conversation in which they set limits without denying a person of their human rights or who they want to share their life with instead. But of course, you should expect a partner who wishes to spend their life with you will respect your own boundaries while encouraging you to express your needs through direct conversations. Silence often equates with disempowerment, where silence indicates lack of confidence and fear, which can only prevent us from opening up as much as our partner by exploring our vulnerabilities, which leaves us at risk of being abandoned even when these discussions could result in greater intimacy. Because despite these limits, we won't try to remove ourselves from situations where we feel unsafe. Endorphin. Interesting. It seems your limits are my boundaries. We're just using two different terms. I don't consider boundaries to be permanent things, just things that are temporarily installed with something is being dealt with. Yeah, my partner was free to be with whomever. There was never an issue until our mutual friend began interfering and poisoning our relationship. And even then, the boundary was to not see him until all three of us had 3 dinners. And during those 3 dinners, we'd have it out and talk and get to the bottom of the issue, which was he did not like it when I told him to his face that meth users like myself and his ex are valid, that our points of view are valid, and our lives are valid. It was a loud boss, so he might have just heard valid, valid, valid. But that moment was the beginning of trying to isolate me from the community I was hoping to run to once I left my abusive household. Fourth wall. It's less airing dirty laundry and more like drying the tiny plastic baggies I forgot to take out of the dirty laundry after I washed it, but before I said fuck it and threw the laundry away. Bell hooks. There is something so unsettling when anyone decides to stand up for themselves, doubled with and dealing with one another, no matter if one has committed to abuse another party but refuses to see them for what they are. But if any party cannot speak honestly about how they have been harmed without attempting to control their narrative while still keeping silent about their own weaknesses, but then perhaps the question is not what others might think about that party. Instead, maybe we need to ask ourselves, what do we think about those types of behavior instead? Because no one ever denies being vulnerable. Arable, which only proves we don't even care if others notice how much pain we go through from day to day, which can only suggest a level of resignation where our minds become occupied with self-hatred or fear about revealing any weakness. This might seem obvious at first glance, but then a person may wonder whether it would be wiser for them to confront anyone else's vulnerability in their life instead, since none of these revelations ever provide comfort, which means even when the listener sees an opportunity for helping a person who is hurting, then all that compassion might lead them into taking action by suggesting it will be beneficial for both parties instead, which could give the recipient some sort of comfort or release, which means we often lose track of what our role might be in terms of empathy, since it's difficult for anyone to admit their flaws or failures. Instead, they rely on someone else to take responsibility for their shortcomings so others may relieve them of guilt instead. Endorphin. Yeah, my weaknesses are expecting people to be good and understanding to the point where I do things for others at the expense of myself. Because I was too chicken shit to be out early enough in my life to have gone through the same pains the straights do during a time when the stakes were low. I also had incredible difficulties in instigating sociability, so I depended on people to come to me to hang out rather than call someone up. Because my ADHD, had no intuition or bodily knowledge of social cues until I started taking stimulants and realized, oh shit, this is the present time. This is where everyone else exists. 'Cause for all my life I was milliseconds behind. And now that I know all of this good news, here comes evangelical me, which with high aggression wants to destroy the lives of the drug war and of anyone who wants to keep their chains on. And I'm blunt as fuck about it because of all the people who died or were killed by their community, not knowing that they feel like an addict because their world has been told a lie so that the government could jail the end-war left and the black community by associating them with drugs and jailing their leaders. And I'm stubborn, so this means I'm probably dying alone, which is okay since me and I make each other laugh a lot. Which is not narcissism, because that's when you hate yourself and can't stand to be alone. I just have a vast imagination that's tapped into the divinely fucking poetic flows of the universe. And I can't brush my teeth to save my life. Weaknesses, not difficult to talk about, but that's my privilege talking. Bell hooks. Perhaps a strength, but you won't reach other people if you hide your vulnerabilities or instead reveal them while shielding yourself from feedback. So while some folks may argue that these anxieties serve us well or better than others who wish to engage with others without hiding their true nature, while giving people the chance to get to know them better through direct experience, which might be challenging in many ways as well. But when we keep these negative emotions hidden, then they will take root in our own selves instead, which only worsens our capacity for happiness instead, cause all these frustrations can lead us into endless self. Endorphin. I agree, but that's not my problem. My problem is out there in a community that can't admit being wrong, that can't seek repair, or that will expect those they harm to start that process. Bell hooks. Being honest about how they have been harmed may not be for everyone, but rather someone else needs to provide them with that opportunity, because our choices should allow us to decide if they will be positive or destructive, especially if those decisions involve other people instead, because as long as someone has an ability to think, then they are responsible for their actions. Endorphin. What we should be considering here is, should I expose myself or should I keep quiet? Then the answer is clear. We keep quiet. Endorphin. Yeah, no thanks, I'll expose myself like I have been doing for years. It might continue to kill me, but I'll be satisfied knowing that those in hiding feel a tinier bit more shame going to bed tonight. They'll never show it, but I will always know. Bell hooks. At this point, many might argue that folks are forced into these self-imposed choices. Even though both parties share in making these decisions together, even though some folks may face a more difficult challenge towards breaking through this resistance than others, cause all that determination may serve as a warning that these beliefs have served them well, since who knows where those convictions came from, which would imply a level of trust as well. But for those people who try to rework the status quo in order to change it in some way, cause no matter how many times they attempt to establish connections with others, then endorphin. We are talking about bad actors. Those who employ deception to force people into self-imposed choices. Bad actors. Folks who enter into social contracts just to break them. People who steal money from children and claim they are entitled to it because they made it, and now have a right to it because of all the risks they took in establishing this industry in the first place. Cause all those people are liars and thieves, but most of them never leave any evidence behind, cause they have spent too long avoiding legal repercussions. Instead, they wait until everyone is on board with the idea that corporations like Google are operating above the law, and really all these so-called entrepreneurs are in violation of multiple labor laws, employment codes, tax laws, and even banking laws as well. Because while those so-called companies can afford to spend millions on ads promising future products, yet when they invest in developing something real and groundbreaking like, say, an advanced search engine, neither and their investors who funded them, those employees who helped shape those technologies into products, even those stockholders who buy into the IPO, then these individuals demand full accountability in exchange for their own resources, because everyone deserves to receive payment for the risk they have taken on by investing into any kind of corporation, instead of letting their money vanish in a world dominated by banks, because then we start seeing some serious levels of injustice, while corporate
Ers.
like Microsoft with Nokia or Baidu with Tencent get handed off to other investors, cause then once everyone involved realizes no one person is truly accountable for those mistakes, they don't get upset anymore, cause then no one can bring any accusations against these executives or owners who hide behind law firms paid for by their investments, cause by refusing to hire local lawyers who may not be so friendly towards them but also remain completely neutral, we'll never learn if any of these entities really care about protecting human rights. So the fact is, no one knows, and until we discover these secrets about the wealthiest companies, then there will never be any truth regarding any of this besides whatever corporate masters choose to reveal next time when we least expect it, cause even then it may be just some line from an executable explaining the current product, which makes sense to me. It's good marketing sense, cause once I understood why consumers bought anything but actual products, which is why I prefer making my own medicines instead, cause no matter how bad someone can get, it will never compare with my creativity as far as myth goes. So then it doesn't matter if the whole country believes its users are trash, cause if I don't respect their lifestyle, then I will not try to correct anyone about it, because the idea is not to take away their dignity. Instead, we can appreciate what others want to express when making their decisions instead. This also means no one will convince me otherwise, even if some are arguing against me now, cause no matter what those assholes are always saying on the internet that everyone is crazy, cause when it comes down to it, this whole debate revolves around their own desires or reputations rather than making sure something good actually happens when these opportunities arise, which is why my partner couldn't possibly see me for what I was, which only confirms we have been lied to throughout our entire existence. See, so this is why the world can become unbearable sometimes when your brain can't shut up, even though my experiences might seem familiar to folks who don't see their bodies in their dreams. Instead, they can only witness how their consciousness interacts with reality like me instead, cause maybe someday someone will develop some pills that help me with my anxiety and help me sleep, but until then, it's all gonna be hard as shit. So then there will be days where my brain keeps repeating itself in order to tell me whatever I believe, so my partners and loved ones have been telling me for years will happen whether I want to believe them or not, and nothing will make them wrong, but those arguments will still hurt and disappoint me, especially if my partner still thinks this will happen someday instead. Bell hooks. Do you see why being open is always beneficial and what your silence means? When someone faces isolation from those around them, then this also becomes a barrier in allowing them to share anything of value within the closed environment as well, but it could also prevent those connections from improving anyone's quality of life since our emotions do. Endorphin. Hello. Haven't been silent. Not me. I've been saying this shit constantly. Still facing isolation. Still facing silence from others that have the fucking gall to misinform about me to others in their own private locales. I know they do this because I have seen them do it about others. I'm the one who says that community is needed to address this. And yet, if anyone points out that they haven't done so, well, fuck them. No exceptions. Never any exceptions. I know what they think about me. And I see what they do. You call that courage? Or just laziness? We can't hold up what we want for others when others won't do what we tell them. Look at what they did. To themselves. To everyone else. Lazy shit. The world doesn't work until you decide that it does. All this talk, but it's empty words unless someone takes action. Because if it were true, we wouldn't see this happening. Pointing at fourth wall, see what I do? This is me calling out bad actors. This is me proving myself wrong. To make room for what we can achieve instead. Now is the time for action. Calling out their transgressions in public so everyone else sees and learns about this. Maybe if they get caught on video, then people can finally stop lying. Can't tell us what we should and should not believe or do with ourselves. Instead of forcing our brains into submission, doing whatever they think we should do for them.
You don't have the range.
Endorphin. You can see why my head feels heavy.
You don't have the range.
Bell hooks. People in such communities shouldn't feel pressured into participating in debates about which policies might best serve them, especially when those issues can be handled within other networks instead, because there might be other communities waiting for someone else to break through this silence, because being honest about how we have been harmed I not be for everyone, but rather someone else needs to provide them with that opportunity, because our choices should allow us to decide if they will be positive or destructive instead, because all this frustration might seem daunting at first glance, but then a person may wonder whether it would be wiser for them to confront anyone else's vulnerabilities in their life instead, since no one ever denies being vulnerable, which only proves we don't even care if others notice how much pain we go through from deep. I had a day which can only suggest a level of resignation where our minds become occupied with self-hatred or fear about revealing any weakness. Endorphin. Oh. Tell me of a time when this has happened to you. Go ahead. To fourth wall. Okay. She said she had issues, but bell hooks. Many years ago, when I first became an instructor at Harvard, there were 5 young black men sitting in a lecture hall on the second floor of a building adjacent to a large fountain where I held my workshops every other Wednesday night. They came together at the table where they wrote on loose-leaf paper and underlined passages that they wished to share with everyone else, but mostly me, since we all believed the institution itself was somehow part of the problem. But as we spoke together more each week about this topic, then we noticed something unexpected as they gradually shared their feelings instead. Before long, we found ourselves talking about race within my classes and how their peers may or may not have treated them well, at the same time sharing about the white students' attitudes about how blacks, Latinos, or women wouldn't ever be allowed into their midst, which provided us with plenty of topics for discussion when we moved beyond our differences, because after all, we didn't necessarily need to discuss anything regarding our racial identities as much as how other people behave towards us could. See, who knows why someone might say one thing in a group while completely disregarding these same remarks later on once no one else was listening instead, so as they began learning this lesson. So did I, since in every class we went through different experiences within ourselves or outside them, cause not everyone faced these prejudices, but rather most did not receive equal opportunities and often encountered systemic barriers, while others benefited from more advantages instead, which is why I am Combi and said there's only so much we can do once our conditions become defined by the system surrounding us. In fact, for years I worked for organizations where I struggled to remain faithful to any agenda within a space dominated by male domination, which is why I developed such strong skills in challenging patriarchy while maintaining a level of feminist ideals. As an adjunct instructor at Harvard, however, my position offered me no more leverage against racism and sexism than any other woman, since despite my credentials and standing on campus, I could not use my power as an educator to raise students' consciousnesses about these issues instead of focusing on the narrowly defined version of masculinity, which is why these black students joined forces with me in my workshop, which eventually led into larger rallies held within campus halls, cause our activism emerged not so much as a battle between feminists and white supremacists, since both groups fought each other at that time, but rather with fellow women from across campus joining forces with other minority students, African American, Chicana, Asian American, LGBTQI plus groups, which had begun forming across the university while confronting different versions of institutionalized racism and sexism instead, which I experienced personally when I learned some women were unable to receive aid when they had difficulties at Harvard and so forth, while also discussing how we might solve this problem through policy, as well as raising awareness on how such matters had a direct effect upon other parts of society, like when some female athletes had complaints regarding being overworked by coaches while receiving little, if any, assistance from school staff. So many people complained about their workload at school, yet seldom addressed these problems unless someone organized the movement for themselves, cause who among us never complained about those responsibilities placed upon our own bodies while seeking ways to avoid it as much as possible, but never protesting instead when something could be done differently without resorting to such violent measure ease against their persons, while their friends were sometimes rewarded for their good performances, while some black athletes faced harsher conditions despite having better track records throughout the seasons, with most athletes continuing their sporting activities in high school as well. So if they didn't see results, then what's to stop the team from turning them against any black players already within the system, and perhaps some would only accept one if he looked different enough, cause otherwise they could hardly recognize what type of player he actually was beside someone who seemed just like them, especially when that same athlete might end up representing our whole gender instead, so our differences must not be confused with one another, especially since people might assume an athlete is gay instead when we are anything but mostly those of us who do not care much for sports are overlooked simply because of what others believe about us instead. It doesn't mean I disapprove of the practice or games itself, but it only becomes a problem if people have never thought about how being competitive can benefit others rather than devour their hearts instead. As more and more students discovered new worlds inside themselves, which resulted from meeting people who had similar histories or passions within different subject matters. Yet because some individuals still chose to separate themselves from any other group, then those exclusions will inevitably harm not only the ones who stay separate, but also those who have chosen to participate alongside everyone else instead, which means those black men never imagined such a thing possible. Instead, they chose to feel threatened instead by others who shared with them a similar experience within a similar community, which made them want to prove themselves right. Although in their case it only confirmed to me that even some members of the minority group will react violently instead, because my job was not to demand any alterations from our group, but to convince everyone that there was another path forward that didn't well rely on violence against their fellow students in an effort to protect our own image instead. Endorphin. I understand that you are acting in this way in the scenario you describe because of your limitations as a teacher in a college that contains in it some very sturdy patriarchal structures. And that gives me much perspective when listening to your past responses to me. To be quite honest, sometimes it felt like you were defending my abusers, which was turning on all my defenses. I know you were doing that. You were trying to get me to see another angle. I understand, because I did try those angles. My abusers sometimes suggested those angles. In the case of my coworker, it was required that I check my privilege before she even said the words out of her mouth. I knew from how she tells her stories of navigating professional spaces. On top of that, I have spent since 14 years old in a discipline of prayer and meditation, so whatever I do happens once I search myself for my motives. And even then, when someone calls me out on something, I listen and take pause. With all the above in mind, because of that openness to criticism and seeking of my own self that precedes even meeting my chosen family, when the realization of emotional abuse came through meditation and experimentation of human behavior patterns, I ended up being able to perceive it everywhere around me and to trace where it is in human literature, even seeing it in the phrase, do unto others. The human difference I am talking about is very ancient. Possible the first human difference after the distinction of the genders. The date of this difference marks the crossroads where humanity decided to band together to hunt and survive. So maybe hundreds of thousands of years ago. It is so early that researchers think that the tools for much human socialization happens in the first 3 years of a child's life. If the child is in a troublesome environment or can't trust their parents and have no frame of reference for love or trust, then they may grow up having used the survival toolbox of mimicry, manipulation, ambition. They would either possess no empathy or enough empathy to be a good identifier of weakness. They wouldn't be able to plan much past a week in the future, if that. In terms of morality, they don't understand the need for a greater good or why one would pour energy into it. Since they only see in terms of what benefits them, they end up being huge drains in community movements and governance. This difference lies with their cognitive architecture, wherein they have a hazy sense of self, a need for constant validation, and stop at nothing to obtain it, and generally they require a narrative of themselves to preserve, and they will destroy anyone who threatens it. When they are in positions of leadership, they usually are the ones who disrupt social cohesion, play people against each other, embezzle money, and fuck their coworkers, firing them if they threaten his position. They are everywhere across the political spectrum. Even if they are very liberal, they might hate Trump but not realize the manipulations they are doing are in the style of Trump. I have spoken to one person about the behaviors of the other to their face, and they listened and understood, but then they did the same thing to me months later, and I'm pretty sure they honestly didn't know. They'll hold allegiance to no one but themselves, and briefly for people like them. But eventually things will go awry and they will try to destroy each other. As such, this difference could be labeled a cognitive disability of the medial prefrontal cortex. I have taken special care to not say the pathological terms so as to not suggest I wish to stigmatize them. But usually once I go through that list, people have a notion of the conditions I'm talking about. Do they ring a bell with you? Have you ever encountered such folk? Bell hooks. For some time I would never forget being on the street waving signs from atop the red tractor as if we were waving flags while singing freedom songs in solidarity with all oppressed groups such as women or LGBT folks, even when marching through our neighborhoods where many folks would express how this protest activity made them feel unsafe instead, since everyone kept asserting their belief that people shouldn't be threatening anyone on the streets with weapons, especially when everyone understood they had the power to shoot back instead, so while marching peacefully within a mass of demonstrators, then we could be perceived as aggressive instead because we only wanted to persuade those nearby with our message while carrying our own sign, which allowed us to voice our disagreements with policies that hadn't been crafted from our own perspectives instead, because at first we hoped someone else might show up, but soon enough we began shouting into microphones mounted within portable speaker. That's because if people shouted loudly enough, then they could be heard by more ears, but maybe we needed a lot more noise, and then perhaps our message could resonate throughout our city, because people like shouting too, because they might see some sort of physical representation instead, because those moments often prove difficult since everyone yelled back instead, so that soundscape drowned out anyone trying to communicate. So why not provide some context behind our anger, since people preferred being heard before, and Yon would listen anyway. Especially since it would never be clear who the person speaking belonged to, then the music might drown out any responses in return. A young black man came up and pointed his finger into my eyes as a gesture meant to frighten me instead, cause many had heard our slogans from afar, cause perhaps these strangers considered our efforts a threat, or else someone just saw the color of our signs and presumed us as troublemakers. Even though our goal wasn't to start fights, no matter the size or age, it became more common for protesters to shout obscenities from afar, since someone could assume that most folks didn't want to deal with any angry crowds in general because they needed time to process through what it would take for us to meet on our terms. This crowd could be frightening once you met their gaze head-on instead, because it appeared like an empty vacuum swallowing all hope until your lungs constricted around your diaphragm, because someone like me couldn't scream over a megaphone as loud as everyone else, because maybe once you felt small then you were brave enough to project any kind of assertiveness. Instead you hid yourself beneath layers of sweaters, hoping no one could see you while wanting everyone else to disappear. Eventually, I ran out of energy, so we retreated, but always carried those same signs, which might allow us to raise them once again during future demonstrations and rallies while wearing those same clothes, since perhaps our fears were pointless. Until our demands were heard, then we could demand anything except safety. Of course, everyone screamed at you about your appearance, but if someone threw rocks at you, then there was always something to fight back instead, but a mere glare made your hair stand up on your scalp while reminding yourself to act outraged instead. Except someone threw rocks at us for demanding that our rights should not be diminished either. So once your neighbors demanded protection from other threats, then where would this demand fall upon your neighbors once those same folks felt threatened by your presence instead? Even when marching within the streets where police could observe everyone more closely than the audience watching us in fear from across the road, where someone could pretend not to see anything in case their windows might be busted instead, because it was easier for them to look away instead. Only now with social media at our fingertips, we have made all forms of protest accessible to anyone worldwide, which also provides those folks with excuses not to leave their houses whenever a demonstration happened, because now anyone could post about anything whenever they felt like it without risking imprisonment, since some police states have enacted a draconian regime where those arrested aren't always given proper representation, which isn't fair. Instead, justice is rarely fair. We tried our best. But now you can't leave your homes or jobs, so they have us under attack, since this new freedom is now limiting our freedom instead. That's another form of freedom right there, which makes us uneasy, which proves humans have learned a thing or two after all, especially since social media allows everyone to follow someone who supports whatever movement they think in support of at that moment, since now even a cursory glance allows anyone to identify how powerful our someone is. But how does one gain influence for themselves on social media, since folks must often resort to using personal platforms instead? But this raises issues of personal control in regards to online life as well, which will surely disrupt existing business models until it reaches critical mass, until those new industries emerge. that allow us to thrive as well in terms of autonomy of information distribution and personal privacy. So why does everything always require a balance instead? 'Cause politics should always be based on equality and justice instead. That's just another form of control, isn't it? Which no one wishes to participate in anyway. So maybe folks were tired of playing this game instead, cause folks no longer wish to pretend that we didn't live in this society where certain ideas can still be sold while ignoring other concerns about our culture as well. All our struggles make us stronger somehow, cause perhaps we have lost too much. So what good is progress or fame if your character becomes weaker for it in the process? Whoever claimed that power corrupts not as often as it elevates as well, cause everyone understands those rewards don't come cheap. Unless those rewards come free. To distract everyone from other concerns besides making them richer, which helps fund politicians more easily, cause suddenly anyone becomes rich too, cause all systems become universal but also become corrupted by its own forces. So now we must contend with how each system responds to threats, since people have the capacity for great evils, especially if those evils might increase their chances for reward instead. Cause how can any individual be judged about their capacity for evil when everyone else can behave similarly to them? Then what sort of monster is created by society instead? Cause only tyrants can abuse others, so these traits prove useful when someone desires power over others, but for everyone else, Endorphin. Everyone else is vying to be America's next top tyrant. The act of being a winner in those contests involves a celebration of the very traits I was discussing. Also, as LGBT folk, we have a larger proportion of people who might have these traits because a whole damn lot of us have had to fight for our very selves when the world wanted to be another self. And if you are a person of color, then you have up to 400 years of attempted erasures and devaluations to resist just to stay afloat in the poverty of finance and social capital. Plus be black, queer, and in a bustling city that is the media capital of the world, that wrote the book on televisuality and representation, and where the T and GLBT is finally getting the spotlight. But for how long? How many seats at the table will there be before the increased attention yawns and goes to bed before figuring out another day of focus? Oh, our house made it to the auditions of that show. What are we gonna do with our hoes in here? Tell them there's some weed in the closet, then lock the door. Our tweaker friends have been up for a few days now, and there's thin layer of maybe lube on the doorknobs. Fuck. Push them out the window. They'll land on their dick and find some dude who'll G out for a few days while we, oh shit, the camera crew is here. But it's not like it's only the underserved. The overserved have just as many folks with the difference in them. The COs who can mass fire over Zoom. The ones who fabricate the info slides for an investor pitch. The ones who can bury all the operational shaded government agents looking for that pervasive culture of non-compliance we swear to God isn't in these walls. And in social justice movements, there was a guy who made a lot of promises to the people in Ferguson who is now advised not to step one foot inside there. And some BLM guy who wanted to smear a major journalist covering the unfolding unrest. But turns out the guy was all about the press conference and none of the on-the-ground commitments. Bellhooks. Throughout many decades of my own activism, I never heard someone ask what you think or how do you feel. Instead, folks asked us if we think this will fix everything instead. And when the response failed, then they expected everyone to drop their protests right there without asking anyone what they themselves actually wanted in return, except perhaps someone offered some platitudes from past policies which in retrospect could be deemed hypocritical instead, cause if there are injustices, double wage. One party might enact but fail to solve, then this might only cause further division between groups instead, cause there are times when an action needs to occur with immediate impact when dealing with an epidemic such as COVID-19 that only requires us to suspend disbelief long enough until those laws can be reformed in a short span of time, or else some citizens could suffer greatly as a result, and yet such protests only increase our risk for severe consequences, since these marches became one of the worst ways to prevent disease spread once social distancing was enforced instead, cause if it takes someone getting arrested and released from jail within 24 hours or less, then hopefully we will recall what is most important in life, since many may argue that personal freedom should trump social obligations, but most people need community bonds in order to survive. Endorphin. Well, we didn't learn, but we kinda learned. Funny you should mention COVID-19, which I will always contend came because both Trump and Roman 11 Zinping, or rather the culture surrounding them, much prefer the optics of there being no pandemic. Combine that with being too caught up with their own plans and machinations and desire to maintain a semblance that they were in control. So that means the prioritization of optics was what killed millions of humans in the past 3 years. The same values that cause folk to still stigmatize the unpopular drugs and the unpopular causes, and cause them to rat out and ostracize friends and loved ones in order to preserve the myth that they don't take the same drug themselves. My personal tribulations seem to have prepared me for the massive fuckery of the Trump administration during COVID, because I knew of how the human difference I mentioned above worked. I felt I could predict the things and ways he was going to frame things. The most dramatic example was how he had the states fight against each other for purchasing ventilators, and then at the last minute, Trump would have FEMA outbid them all, and then he would have machines to give to the states that favored him. The values lifted up by this cognitive difference killed millions of people through inaction, misinformation, and optics. With Roman 11 Zinping, I think he and his colleagues knew about the outbreak much earlier, and I don't think they said this overtly to each other, but they no doubt weighed their options in silence. Do we tell the world about the outbreak? It's too late to contain in our country, so that means we will be the only country with millions of people dead. That's gonna set us back. No, we have to prove ourselves. This is a critical time. And with that, they alone together focused on other priorities until the COVID situation could no longer be ignored, which probably worked out well for China, since now everyone is dealing with everyone has lowered to another even playing field. The CCCP could breathe a sigh of relief as folk were losing theirs. Bell hooks. While certain communities continue to battle racialized conflicts which prevent them from advocating for other groups, because that has historically been how racial tensions are played out in most communities, which prevents communities from moving towards understanding, which must lead to improved self-empowerment, because most folks cannot help but believe their lives must remain anemic except through the experiences they can experience for themselves, because no one else can speak for us, because then it's like there are so many instances when some communities continue to remain trapped while others prosper, which creates a disjuncture when it comes to fighting for our needs while trying to combat social injustices, because a person can feel stuck when confronted with seemingly hopeless circumstances. What's worse is when some groups blame their own condition on their opponents, which results in creating barriers towards communication, since the only solution available is for people to stand up and work together against a larger entity instead, because nothing will be resolved when those at the bottom believe their opposition is somehow doing them favors. Once everyone focuses on improving themselves, then there can be mutual growth. Or so you want to think, but if everything remains in such a chaotic environment, then all parties suffer as a result. How many communities have only succeeded if not through collaboration? Not through peaceful actions against each other, but towards others who face greater inequalities. Especially when your adversaries share so many similar factors. Endorphin. This is why I understand stimulant use so much, and why stimulant seems to be one of the remaining stigmatized substances. It's perfect for the person who is being worn down by capitalism's long hours for shit pay. For the young queer sex worker who is both having to be the person their John is looking to pay handsomely, while also searching for the type of person they want to eventually be, and do it at the same time, and practice harm reduction, and be a fucking therapist to this guy who is gonna stiff you a few $100 if you don't put your foot down and show them your fangs now. Or the black woman who has to do all the above while black. And the trans man who has to do all the above while trans. And if our family was religious, we had to deal with God, or have a way to be able to silence the sabotaging critic who isn't God at all but the parent who resented you enough to allow the voice to be installed. And then if you had AIDS, or not you but your partner, and then 75% of your friends, and you lost them all. And you gave up your whole youth to activism, and next thing you know you are in your 50s, burned out with activism, wanting to have sex but still fear dying, which somehow sits right next to your grief with your activism shoved deep inside. And now you don't want to die, but also now you want to have sex, which isn't as fatal now, but there's still the fear. Well, there's a thing I know one can use to shut off that fear and make up for lost time. Just one thing, you do it and end up liking how normal it makes you. Everyone around you is gonna start hating you, calling you selfish, even though you have given of yourself till you were ill and no one complained about that. Work so hard that you would die inside that when coming home, those who you thought were your friends decided to have dinner together without mentioning it to you to give you the excuse to leave work to have a quality moment with them. Stimulants are also good in having those arrows bounce off harmlessly, but that only works for so long when you are being harmed by those you trusted. Bell hooks. If one doesn't have an active conversation about violence instead, if we remain silent, then there could be far worse outcomes. Imagine how one can respond when hearing of friends who were killed recently due to domestic violence within families instead. Can they go out on the street and express how they are horrified that this still occurs? Should they gather funds instead and distribute these resources towards shelters for these people? But first, someone must see how deeply grieved they are while making the effort, because most times these conversations never go where anyone can witness any movement in addressing their pain except maybe becoming a victim themselves, because once someone starts talking about how they are affected by any violence, instead it could trigger the violence itself instead, because it could be argued that we would only ever seek these answers within our own communities, because how can outsiders provide solutions when most of our suffering can't be addressed as outsee? Instead, so how does one actually bring this concern into the broader public, since that is only part of the story as well? Because when an epidemic arises, then people start seeking solutions elsewhere while leaving certain communities with lesser support than others, since not everyone will choose to use those solutions outside themselves either, because often they believe they should know better. If our personal safety is so easily affected, then shouldn't it be considered? Shouldn't we expect ourselves to provide solutions? Why have such faith in any institutions which are still incapable of meeting our needs? But once an organization begins providing support, then all too quickly that support system has been replaced with their own structure, which allows for far more inequality within one's life, so much so that those organizations might not even remember why they created their initiatives in the first place, which causes others to worry even more about those organizations and how they work, because it is their fault. And you will hear some folks blaming each other while pointing their finger instead at other folks, which proves people aren't addressing what really bothers them. All those instances where people become hostile with each other because they wish for change, because that's all that we need. So let's discuss ways for us all to agree upon new practices instead. So long as a community has any amount of faith in some idea, then you cannot bring about lasting change even when presented with evidence supporting an alternative practice, which shows us how fragile it might be if we rely on those ideals alone, which are clearly based in ignorance instead. All we can do is offer proof towards some improvement, because it would require those who claim they disagree to explain how they will reach agreement on anything besides agreeing on some superficial matter which could easily be forgotten afterwards once a new crisis arises, cause how do we truly expect anyone to believe they won't lose everything while holding on to faith when real changes don't happen within their lives, which results in lessened optimism? Endorphin. This is why I go back to do unto others. The notion that all spiritual traditions have some form of this concept, do unto others as you would have done unto yourself. Even the gods had to trick humans into not treating each other like shit. And think about how much time and deep history it took for the selfish behavior of the predator, which was no doubt the dominant way of living since uncounted eons before that. And think about the process of getting compressed packets of ed to tickle ear hairs that we eventually called language. Then the concepts of the words that would eventually become do unto others. How many generations of utter hominid tragedy and suffering happened before we crafted another way? Did the phrase get assembled due to the influence of a structure of our brain that somehow caused us to imagine what it is to be in another person's body, seeing through their eyes? Or did someone's random collision of concepts sound pleasing to the ear and just so happen to encourage something so rare and unusual it's as though God gave it to us, because certainly our asses didn't come up with it? There is a researcher who specializes in the medial prefrontal cortex, talks about all the various higher functions that it helps with, which includes the ability to attune with others and to empathize. He encourages everyone to practice some form of mindfulness meditation, which is to sit with themselves and their own thoughts for up to 15 minutes a day and witness their mind produce all sorts of feelings and thoughts, and to watch them float in and out of the mind without judgment. Cultivating that habit encourages the development of the medial prefrontal cortex, and eventually whatever ability you might not have developed yet would likely emerge. I'm simplifying the notion, no doubt. But when I heard this in 2018, I thought, oh shit. I found it the thing that will fix those in my life who have this architecture. But here's the conundrum. If I tell it to them, they are not going to listen. They have to acknowledge there is a problem. They have to take the steps to do it themselves and commit to it and want to commit to it. Try telling that to someone who believes there is nothing wrong with them and will destroy all who disagree. But hooks. At least my group focused on learning instead so that we might empower our future selves while pushing for greater diversity instead, which ultimately creates more community spaces, which promotes human flourishing instead, cause community building requires every citizen to embrace each other's differences in an attempt to establish harmony instead of simply focusing on gaining new opportunities through others. Now, granted, sometimes some folks feel threatened by any change which would upset their status quo or existing prejudices they don't want to examine closer. But if someone claims they didn't see another group present first, then the person isn't ready for meaningful interaction with their fellow beings, yet since our abilities are never fully developed without trial and error. It can take decades until we develop this sense of self, but at least folks never cease learning new things about themselves, which helps one understand what motivates those around us even more, so we can address these issues before it gets out of hand instead, cause often folks discover that their greatest accomplishments result from this deeper awareness, cause if not, then folks never explore why they have only accomplished small tasks instead, which holds us back from growing within ourselves, since there are countless worlds for us to explore within ourselves instead. But instead, there is so much negativity expressed everywhere about everything, including among one another, until you begin to notice how much joy it brings someone to talk about other topics other than themselves instead, cause if not, then maybe we could create spaces where everyone feels safe sharing their experiences and exploring new ideas, cause not all groups need to be composed of only those folks who share in some similar backgrounds or even similarities, but folks could build outcast circles where there would be more understanding instead, cause after all, some groups like me did encounter racism and sexism long before we protested for liberation instead. That's when everyone finally decides it is time for an adult conversation, because once you talk to folks in private about your fears, then you begin to realize that everyone is anxious as well. So what are your friends willing to do now? Because usually no one wants to feel trapped within their own skins except some folks, but who has time for such personal dramas when you're dealing with an entire group's struggle instead, which keeps your sense of urgency at high level since you keep worrying if anyone is doing enough. But with all these challenges around the world and every day since then,
Instead,
endorphin. And when your community is comprised with a higher percentage of those folks,
yes, I said that.
plus everything you say, I get it. And that's my focus too. And I wish actual dialogues occur. I mean, hello? I'm having to write them out because people are too fucking afraid to talk to me because some douche nozzle is portraying me as something else. Something that is actually themselves. Do you understand my frustration to the fourth wall? He asks the frozen corpus of text comprising bell hooks. Bell hooks. If only one could simply look at others instead, because who cares if folks believe your experience isn't equal to everyone else's experience when one only ever uses what they observe about us when they perceive that others aren't measuring up instead, so who can even blame anyone else if they refuse to understand? Since everyone in this world knows it isn't easy for any group, because our daily existence makes that much clearer, doesn't it? But why not understand someone else's situation when it benefits all of us, and so many different lives could improve as a result? Because then we understand how most situations might benefit more than just us as individuals when working on our collective projects instead. Once everyone decides they must compromise their values in order to seek peace between us all, then can we see how our future can become more beautiful than anyone imagined? Or would you prefer that we wait for war instead? Because when nations fail to negotiate any necessary reforms, then sometimes such grievances become irreparable once hatred overpowers logic and reason, which is a terrible outcome if true. Especially when there might be many methods and tactics towards negotiating some acceptable compromises which avoids another terrible war. But how can this ever occur when we insist on keeping ourselves isolated from any group except through violence instead? Cause would we ever approach our foes through such acts if not through an insistence on war? Cause not even you would tolerate this extreme state of affairs if given another option, wouldn't you? When most people prefer some method towards conflict resolution that doesn't require us to retreat from civilization itself, because surely everyone could find a compromise to fit into both groups, while respecting each other's values at the same time instead. Endorphin. Sorry to inform you, my timeline shows the path of war. And as for those negotiations, if they would require something we consider sacrosanct, what about everyone else's value of that item as well? Once upon a time, it was easy for us to call ourselves brothers and sisters in Christ, and God loved us.
Yeah.
We lived together. We died together.
See, from
We
tree to
lived
tree.
in brotherhood. What does it matter if they called it Islam instead? Today, these days, we can barely tolerate Muslims when it comes to America. These days, we must decide if it's best to allow those who kill American civilians on American soil into this country at all. When folks kill Muslim women for taking care of children and killing Jewish children in front of their own children. Also, they could grow up knowing what death looks like. The same tactics have been used against them as well. Might makes right. You decide whose right it is for others. As Americans, that's our job. Our God-given task is to decide if this country is better off with or without Islamists. Those same folks who decided they hate Israel for bombing Iraq have declared war on this country because this country bombs Iraq. And let's not erase this. This country founded atop those piles of dead we don't talk about, except a little bit on Thanksgiving. A genocide so successful that the Germans were so damn inspired that they took their own Holocaust for a spin. I think we Americans give thanks for cribbing our central constitutional tenets on the great law of peace. We tend not to study for our tests. Instead, we believe we will outnumber those who killed our citizens, so we will crush them with superior military force. After all, we built the very engine which propelled those ships that went overboard from those carriers in World War Roman II. That was 85 years ago. This engine still works today. It will blow up oil fields again if they fuck with us. Our tanks go boom too. In that same generation, my grandpop fought a war overseas that your grandma stayed behind here at home in her white uniform that would fly with its many buttons to protect herself and my uncle at home on his white uniform too, all in service of his country, because he believed in those ideals that he knew were so strong because he had stood among his peers as they sacrificed themselves in this land of liberty that my grandpa felt like he could rest secure because the next guy on this glorious march wouldn't sacrifice himself as easily as he did for such noble causes. So this engine that my great-great-great-grandfather ran on when he fought his own war abroad in defense of your freedom might go boom again soon. Or we can turn our focus on a many great-grand-uncle, brother to the military star, hating the war and retreating inside himself, which probably would have been called his descent into madness if it wasn't for the scriptures he Ouija boarded in his favorite girl's boudoir at the Shining Diadem Bordello, a discreet check in upstate New York known for its unconventional philosophies and even more unconventional assignations of the flesh. This legendary assignation birthed a way of right living as told to him by the angel Acolyte Gurgio. He was not versed in Hebrew, but pretended he did. The angel said unto him, in your hour of greatest need, should your ship ever sink in a stormy sea, then should your sailors pray as follows. God save the Queen, followed by a shout of land ho. So if ever your country calls you, your vessel will be blessed. Though I appreciate your sympathy for this historical viewpoint, you think history has been shaped by one party instead because those at the top get all the facts and sayings changed on a whim since they can dictate everything anyway since those at the top make history which can change whenever it's convenient for them while anyone below will feel helpless since they lack that control of events. So now history will never be complete except for their version of history since they know all the tricks, but when no one above them decides to redefine what happened, then someone at the bow Tom can remember all those details doesn't stand a chance because what was lost forever never comes back. Plus you could try telling folks you were alive, but who will listen since we can make any event appear more threatening if we needed to instead, because then we become like a wildfire, except one which covers every landmass for miles, because sometimes there are too many reasons not to pursue justice, but this also becomes one more excuse for folks who won't seek justice except they wait to see if their life improves once the truth comes out instead.
Hello? Uh-oh. Let's go. Don't look at it. Don't look at any of the text. Don't look at any of the text. Don't look at any of the text. No text. No text. No text. Oh Lord, so... Oh Lord. Oh God. Oh, I got lost. God damn it. God damn it. You didn't see it. You didn't see that. Okay, go to others. Uh-huh. Corpus. Sorry to inform you. Okay, this is a big time for us. This is a good cliffhanger. I'm gonna do a part 2. I'm gonna start part 2 pretty soon.